So without further ado, I want to introduce Elizabeth Lev to the stage. Elizabeth Lev is an art historian, author, and tour guide. She's a best-selling author and international speaker and certified sommelier. She teaches Baroque, Renaissance, and Christian art at Duquesne University in Rome. Her presentation is Returning to Wonder, Lessons from the Giants of Italian Art. Please give a warm welcome to the stage to Elizabeth Lev.
Just so you know, the sommelier thing is because I've been teaching sophomores for 20 years. You gotta find something to do. All right, so, good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me here. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you to the sponsors of this program, but mostly, thank you to the people who are here as part of a commitment towards a return to the arts, a renewal in the world of arts. You are the ones who deserve an applause today, because you guys are really the first person to make this all happen. And because we all have something in common as Catholic art lovers, I think I'm going to be starting with just a question. So why do Christians make sacred art? We have churches filled, museums filled. We have Christian art everywhere you look, but why? Other religions, the great monotheistic religions, they don't make art. Muslims don't make sacred art. Jews don't make sacred art, and there's a reason for this. So why did the Christians embark on this great adventure of art? And it's not really intuitive if you think about it. The first commandment is pretty clear on the subject. Like, there's nothing. No animals, nothing that flies in the air, walks on the earth, or swims in the sea. And as far as I can tell, we haven't canceled any of the other commandments. I believe like the whole murder and bearing false witness are still on deck. So why an exception to this particular commandment? And the fact is that our forefathers in the faith struggled with this. In the very, very early years of Christianity, this was a very serious problem. This idea of making art it smelled terribly close to idolatry. And to kind of paraphrase Origen, I would say he kind of explained it as pagans make art and look what a mess they are. So this idea of following in the footsteps of, the wrong-headed religion, why would the Christians do that? But ultimately the Christians decided to embrace the creation of art and unleash that unique Catholic imagination on the world. And because of one thing, it's the Incarnation. And though it took many years to be able to articulate it clearly, this articulation that you see here of St. John Damascene, which we've used in church councils from years and years and years, it gave, however, Christian artists a official green light. The Incarnation, the idea of God, who is ineffable, who is impossible of being circumscribed, when he chose to circumscribe himself in human form as Jesus Christ, then it becomes licit to make an image of him. So it is God's own self-revelation that opened the door to the visual arts, and going further, it remains to this day the opening to the visual arts. I would say that the ultimate mandate of Christian art, Christian sacred art, is incarnational, a reminder of this incredible event, 2,000 years old and yet 2,000 years new. As an art historian, and you as Catholic artists, every morning when we get up and go to work, we ought to be mighty happy because we got a twofer for this one. Not only are we redeemed and we get to hope in eternal life, but we got a job. So this is the art incarnation, a total plus. All right, so it was exactly that spirit of joyful thanksgiving that informed the earliest Christian art. It's interesting to go look at these works that are produced for Christian catacombs under situations or circumstances of extreme persecution. What's going on above ground, everybody's read about the various fascinating forms of torture that the Romans used on Christians that now apparently are used in London galleries. I had to do it. But the fact of the matter is that the Christians made a choice. They didn't want to show the persecution, the suffering scenes, the message. What did they want to get across? Images of healing, images of thanksgiving, images of salvation. So this was the face that the Christians put forward. Christian art opened a window into the amazing interior life of the followers of Christ, the hope that is within him, as within them, as Peter would say. The Catholic imagination produced a unique relationship between the temporal and the eternal. So even after the legalization in 313, when the church began to get more involved with geopolitics out in the world, Christian artists set themselves a task of elevating the mind and heart, what John Ruskin would describe as the sublime. Whether it was in Byzantine churches or in the broad sweeps of Italian chapel murals, art offered a means to deepen the faith through transcendence. To this day, art is one of the things that is one of the great calling cards of the Christian culture. Those who might never want to go to a mass, those who would never go to a mass, will actually they flock these Gothic cathedrals. People who do not want to hear about, Christ's salvific sacrifice, they're all, scalping tickets to get in to see the Last Supper. So we have a voice, but unfortunately that voice is often muted often by secularist art history, and often other times by the very caretakers of this art who seem a little embarrassed by the power of their charges. So this afternoon, this evening, I'm just going to, as my disclaimer, I'm really just an art historian, so I don't have any quick fixes for you, but I do have an idea to take you on a tour. It's your second tour for the evening. I'm going to take you through a tour of the golden age of Italian sacred art, which is really a series of, it's a progression of achievements that take place basically from 1300 to 1700. And I'm hoping that it might suggest a path for artists and patrons to renew the world of art. I'm looking to the old masters to maybe give us some stepping stones to draw a kind of roadmap to the return of wonder. And by wonder, I mean looking at art with awe and amazement for its skill, its message, and its beauty, and sharing that sense of wonder with the world around us. So what were these achievements in the visual arts? They were, first of all, the establishing of the reality of Jesus and the Incarnation. A very big thing that will happen during this first stage is the establishment of nature and reality in art. The second part is persuasion, an ability to use art as a form of persuasion, a way of underscoring church teaching, a form of rhetoric to make people think differently, to change hearts and minds. And then in the final phase, we have the third, which is evoking wonder at the mystery and the majesty of God. So those of you who have ever been to Italy, or you've studied art history, or you've walked through the Art Institute in Chicago before its recent reorganization, which I found a little unrecognizable, know these three eras well. So here's a little timeline. My students hate it when I do this, but sorry, every now and then we got to create a time playing field. Our first part is going to be looking at about 1300 to 1550. This is the era of the Renaissance. Those of you who studied art history are going, wait a minute, I thought 1401 was the year the Renaissance started. Okay. In our big old art history books, yes, but I want to look at what created the groundswell so that one day we could have the baptistry competition. The second part we'll be looking at is after some setbacks, after some difficulties around 1550, art reparts. There's a kind of renewal in art, and that takes place during the age of the Counter-Reformation. And these two periods, the Renaissance, which has a grounding they're able to ground art in an understanding of reality, and the Counter-Reformation period, which is absorbed in the communication of the Catholic faith, will blossom into the great age of the Baroque, where the Catholic Church, its artists and patrons, succeed in harnessing wonder. That wonder, which I have the joy of seeing every day as I watch people walk into St. Peter's Basilica and see that awe still exist. So, What was the great artistic achievement of the Renaissance? Well, it started out with a return to the natural world. The fact that there would be real events that took place in a realm of physical reality. Nature, by the time we were in for the period that we would describe as sort of the late antique and the early Middle Ages, nature had kind of disappeared from art. The medieval Christian culture preferred to emphasize the divine nature of Christ, and so they used these shimmering mosaic skins covering vaults and this colored glass filtering light through windows. But the culture had recoiled from the abuse of the natural in the late empire, what Chesterton would call nature worship, where, quote, the world was colored by dangerous and rapidly deteriorating passions, by natural passions that becoming unnatural passions. And my original idea was to end the quote there, but sorry, this put me in a position, it's so perfect I have to finish it. Thus, the effect of treating sex as the only one innocent natural thing was that every other innocent natural thing became soaked and sodden with sex. It sounds exactly like what we just heard. But it was Francis's devotion to the human experience of Christ, the reality of his birth and the fact of his death and resurrection helped purify nature so it could return to art. And interestingly, St. Francis began his mission by what? Talking to a work of art. And he himself became a work of art, complete with stigmata. He became a living icon of Christ, right down with the heavenly stamp of approval in Christ's own marks of the crucifixion on his body. Francis made us think in terms of seeing a real Christ among us again. So it helps to really start this impetus of this art. Francis and his followers focused on the fact that nature had been transformed by Christ's sharing in our humanity and therefore elevating our mortal experience. The vulnerable baby in the nude in the night air becomes one of our images. And then, of course, this unforgettable image of the crucified Christ by Giotto, where we see the body of Jesus, cupped hands over the nails, slumped, lifeless. We have this much more physical sense of the reality of Jesus' life on earth. This will allow the human experience to be represented. It elevates for artists the possibility of showing something as simple as a nosy nursemaid kind of listening in to the Annunciation of St. Anne, or my personal favorite in the Upper Basilica of Assisi, the clenched fist of the father who's about to haul off and hit Francis, the perplexed bishop who is like, what are we going to do with this guy? And of course, the two little kids over in the corner who I am quite certain if there was a voice bubble, they would be saying, Francis is naked. So, and that reality of people, that reality of how we are, gets elevated precisely because of the Franciscans helping artists to think in terms of Jesus's human experience. So artists inspired by the new storytelling, we're in a new mode, storytelling. Things that people did to become holy will spark these great new advances in the Renaissance era, from the use of shading to give figures more depth and greater weight and mass, but then the development of one-point linear perspective comes along. And it not only creates a more plausible rendering of the natural world, but it indicates the viewer's participation in it. So in 1426, Masaccio produced this famous Trinity, that's sort of the debut of one-point linear perspective. It's a rational organization of a three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface, and it gives order to painting. So what it means is that all the lines will converge on a single spot, as you will see over here, and in doing so, it creates a rational distance between each one of the figures. And immediately, right out of the starting gate, look what Masaccio does. He confronts you on the left-hand side with this altar and a dead body underneath it. And that is the part that, in the illusion of depth is the closest to the viewer. So the viewer is confronted with this lifeless body under the altar, with the lovely little sign on top of it saying, what you are, I once was, what I am, you will be. And then we move into the next space. You can see the two donors sitting slightly on the outside. Then you have Mary and John slightly on the inside. And then you have the Trinity itself, the Father slightly recessed in the chapel, offering forward the Son. It creates this remarkable sense of a hierarchy of space, where we are versus where God is, but we are all in the same place. It allows us to feel like we are far more participatory in the story. And what converges all of the figures, everything in this painting, is that all the lines meet at the foot of the cross. So this perspective, from the very minute that it's invented, it's rediscovered in a Christian context, the first thing it's used to do is to bring us all together, to unite us at the foot of the cross in this artistic vision. There are different ways of using linear perspective. In the case of Fra Angelico, he uses it to link two stories together, to help that Catholic imagination, which looks at one thing happening in one place, but we can relate it to another story elsewhere. So we have this lovely Annunciation taking place in the foreground. We have these bright colors, the setting of Mary out on her veranda. You can see the bedroom in the background. We discover that Mary always makes her bed. Of course she does. You have this sort of lovely little sort of snippet of the moment of the Annunciation, but the vanishing point is actually further off to the side. The vanishing point takes us over to a darker, where there's the contrast between these beautiful bright colors of the beginning of the victory over sin and death, to that dark moment when Adam and Eve are cast out of the Garden of Eden. So this development, this great way of representing the reality of the spaces, also allows the launching of that Catholic imagination, which is capable of multitasking, of carrying these two stories in at the same time. And of course, the person who most brilliantly of all created a balancing of a story that is grounded in a natural setting, but at the same time projects to the supernatural behind it, is probably one of the most overused images in the history of art. And the Last Supper, which has been so plastered everywhere that we've kind of lost sight of what this painting really was meant to do, was, I think, in one of these, it was a case where we really begin to see the Renaissance stepping into the realm of wonder. Leonardo, of course, had a keen eye for detail. He was an extraordinarily good, very good at this sort of still life type painting, and so grounding the painting in a setting of a supper. So we see the embroidered tablecloth, we see the pieces of bread, the knife on the table, the spilled salt. There's a sense of almost like a Flemish mentality of a still life. Look there, that could be the table that you'll be sitting at for dinner. But he was also a very keen observer of humanity. And one of the striking things as we go from the reality of the things that are on the table to the naturalism of the reactions. So if we looked at we were looking at the Caravaggio Peter, who, me, we can all kind of understand this. Now put that times 12. And each one of these men reacting in one way, one recoiling, one kind of thinking, one going, ma, one of the, that's the Italian, ma. That's probably me. And so it was pointing, indicating we're moved through this painting through a variety of human reactions and human experiences. And so this wonderful ripple effect, Leonardo had a very scientific way of approaching his art, and a great deal of interest in the study of the movement of water, and the underlying backbone of the underlying movement in the composition comes from his reflections on water. So you have the first reaction of Jesus' words, which are a splash on either side. Now you've got Peter leaning away, you've got John leaning away, Peter rushing forward, and then you have something that feels more like a flow out to the outer edges, but Leonardo perfectly constructs the painting so that the outer figures draw your eye back towards the center. This is reinforced by that grid of perspective, which is concealed, that's holding the painting together. This is literally the girding of the painting, so that no matter how you get interested, you get distracted, you float out to the edges of each of these human experiences, Leonardo makes it impossible for us to not come back to Jesus. The painting requires that you return to Jesus, and of course, what a Jesus. A Jesus where he has successfully given us the isolation that we can understand on a human level. You know, all your friends are about to betray you during dinner, so we have this sense of Jesus as this isolated triangle by himself, but at the same time, behind his head, we have this projection towards the infinite, this light that substitutes the halo, this light that extends out, extends out into an infinite distance. In one painting, we have this blending of the being there, feeling like we're there for the actual moment of Jesus' announcement of his imminent betrayal, but at the same time, we have a feeling of how we project through that to the glorious resurrection that will come 3 days after this event. And again, this is where the wonder of being able to put these two things together so masterfully, really, it allows you to get lost in contemplation. And this is an interesting point about the Renaissance. These rapid developments and these extraordinary achievements were due in large part to the spirit of entrepreneurship in the Renaissance. Patrons, private, public, ecclesiastic, or lay, charged the atmosphere with an awareness of art. So people participated in beauty by purchasing public art for chapels and piazzas, holding competitions. They had tremendous competitions for work, and they also purchased art for homes and businesses. The spirit of competition fueled the artists' willingness to learn and to experiment. They always were trying to keep up with the next guy, and it led patrons and artists to vie with pagan antiquity for supremacy in the arts. So even the patrons were competing, not just with each other, but with the legacy that Rome had left of such incredibly beautiful art. And so they collected these works of art, the artists studied them, but then the truly emancipated Catholic imagination, imbued with the faith of Christian teaching, were able to take the goddess of love, an Apollo and an angry Ajax, and turn it into a vision of justice and mercy. So, art, however, is a gamble. Whether it's tearing down an 1,100-year-old basilica to build the new St. Peter's, or rolling the dice on a 25-year-old Raphael to paint your throne room, you're taking risks when you commission art. You just are. And as patrons gave artists greater leeway, allowing genius to shine, there were the occasional mishaps. Now, I feel awkward about saying this because I actually really love this painting, but I realize that it might be a problem. I feel like there was a talk at some point in the 1550s about the problem with this painting. This would be the Martyrdom of St. Lawrence by Bronzino. And just to give you a brief idea of what the problem might be, first of all, I'm having a little trouble spotting St. Lawrence, and I'm not entirely sure why this man over here in this position has to do all of this guy over here who's like stoking the fire. I'm not really sure why everyone's naked either. So, so the church is kind of looking at this going, I'm not sure this is what we ordered. And on the other side of the Alps, we've got the Protestants looking at us going, So there was a lot of this particular period with odd figures, confusing meanings, visual distortions. There was a gap between the artist and the beholders. There was a gap forming between the artist and the beholders, and it really, the church was so disturbed by it that it really threatened to relegate sacred art, contemporary sacred art, to the attic of the evangelical toolshed. However, instead of abandoning its old friend and ally, the church redoubled its efforts to engage artists in the wake of the Council of Trent. And this is, I forgot, I had that little close-up, just because it's a guilty pleasure for me. All right, so this man, Gabriele Paliotti, And there are others, Charles Borromeo, in the interest of time, I'm taking one, but this man is particularly important for the history of art because in 1582 he published the Discourse over Sacred Profane Images. He was the archbishop, the first archbishop of Bologna, and instead of berating artists for their shortcomings, instead of saying, you know, you guys have got it all wrong, and instead of saying, oh, well, you're artists, so you're free to do whatever you want, he reminded them of the lofty responsibility they carried like that of the great orators, defined by Cicero as those who move, delight, and teach. In the discourse, written in Italian, was aimed at artists, and he exhorted them to learn how to speak to a universal artist to become, quote, tacit preachers to the people, end quote. So this is infusing artists with a whole new mission and a dignity that artists have been looking for. They had been looking for through the Renaissance when they were considered craftsmen, and now they're allowed to stand beside the theologians as peers. And furthermore, Pagliotti shared his own tricks of the trade. Here we have some of the great lines. This is the tacit preachers to the people. He has the tricks of the trade, which is defining the audience. So he, as a preacher, is going to share with the painters. So I'm a preacher. I got to talk to everybody. I need a universal language to bring everybody together. And here's what I do. I divide my audience up into 4 categories. I put the English, and I also put the Italian because I think it's funny. The 4 principal things that you have to be able to have in a piece of religious art or piece of sacred art. I will speak to all the audience. The idea of confession, pulchritude, make it beautiful, sanctimony for the pious people who just want to pray in front of the work, please don't upset them, and magnificence, and just the sense of this being able to interpret, to add more to the work. And so these 4 audiences, these 4 types of painting become almost like the marching orders of painters in this age. So their challenge was, however, how to create compelling illustrations of the fundamental tenets of the faith, and they had to do it to a world whose trust was shifting to the empirical. And so how could you talk to people who, if it's not visible, it can't be, if it's not written in scripture, then it doesn't exist? The supernatural garden that had nourished the Catholic imagination was succumbing to a drought. And they were asking the artists to find a way to irrigate it. So we have Federico Fiori, one of the first great Counter-Reformation painters. Federico Fiori, he comes along and he paints for Pope Clement VIII in Santa Maria sopra Minerva, the institution of the Eucharist. And here's the first thing he's done. From Leonardo's Last Supper, emphasizing the human moment of Jesus' betrayal, that story becomes the very first time the Eucharist was instituted. He uses a very interesting construction in which it is a series of three triangles that will converge always on Christ. So this altarpiece placed right above the family altar starts with these 2 guys down at the bottom, and look what they're doing, reaching down into the space of the altar, actually physically seeming to pick up the gifts from the altar. So the gifts are brought to the altar. This one, he's got the bread here, picking up the water over there, he's picking up a vat of wine over there. So this idea of taking the physical objects that are on the altar, then the next set of triangles takes us down from Jesus to Peter and John, bowing low. I mean, we just came from that Mass. I was so excited. I was watching a Baroque painting. I was like, oh my gosh, it's like watching my favorite painting. This beautiful gesture, this sense of reverence that we see in that Mass. So we have that sense of the prayer. What are they doing? They are praying. We have the offerings, the physical materials of the offerings. We have prayer, and what do we get? We get the body of Christ with this wonderful sort of closing triangle that encompasses Jesus holding the host over the red part of his outfit, traditionally symbolic of his body, which again is something that we see a great deal in icons. And so literally, Baroque, with his wonderful colors, he creates a kind of color called colore cangiante, this bright changing color. It feels like the story is happening before you because the light is shifting so dramatically. These figures that come out of your space, breaking the fourth wall, suddenly we are beginning to be swept up into the story, from the natural into the supernatural, and yet in the midst of all of it, we are reminded reminded of the fundamental nature of the Eucharist, teaching, delighting, and moving. And then we have Caravaggio. I feel like Caravaggio's getting a lot of attention tonight. Yeah, and he deserves it. Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew, which is one of the most effective cases, one of the most powerful, persuasive works of art that was produced in this age. It was a mixture of the natural and supernatural, but Caravaggio, whose emphasis was always a little bit more to the natural. And so we have a story here of Matthew, who's the wealthy tax collector, right? So how is Caravaggio going to tell this story differently from like the 1 million times? It's like everyone's favorite story, right? Give up everything, go follow Christ. And what's more, it's being painted in 1600, which is a Jubilee year. So it's a year of tremendous conversion. Everybody's talking conversion. It's a holy year. It's a holy year with 3 million pilgrims coming to Rome looking for something. And Caravaggio is charged with being one of the people who has to give these people what they're looking for. And so in this painting, Caravaggio rethinks things, really emphasizing first impact, what catches everybody's eye when they walk in there. They're really struck by the fabulous clothes. I mean, it's Italy, we like our clothes. It's the Via Condotti of the 17th century. I mean, the way he paints the silks and the velvets and the brocades, the sword and the boy's hip, which is kind of like the newest iPhone that you can't possibly get. This way of sort of representing status and wealth, it's captivating. You look at it and you're like, yeah, I want one of those. Yeah, I want one of those. And just as you start to get lost in the stuff in the painting, the money on the table, the coin kind of stuffed in Matthew's hat, you realize some of these men have looked away. Something's caught their attention. And the thing that catches their attention, of course, is the image of Christ, who has come in with St. Peter next to him, because it's the Counter-Reformation. We got to throw Peter in somewhere. Jesus, who comes in, and with this very sort of laconic gesture, we all recognize it from the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he indicates into the group, follow me. And it creates this incredible moment. Caravaggio really takes us to this moment where the natural hits the supernatural. And so you have a man who's got everything, who suddenly this demand for him to leave everything. And how do we understand the effect? How do we understand how this is going to play out? By Caravaggio's extraordinary use of chiaroscuro. This is a technique that painters have been using for years. It makes a three-dimensional surface on a two-dimensional, it makes a three-dimensional figure on a two-dimensional surface. But the fact of the matter is, the chiaroscuro in the hands of Caravaggio became an actor. He used light as an actor. It is the light that is coming from above the head of Jesus that affects Matthew most directly. It hits him full in the face. He is looking, that is an expression of wonder. Like, what just happened, right? The wide-eyed, utter shock of seeing. Up until that moment, he thought he had seen everything that was beautiful. I got the best clothes in town. I got the best car in the garage. I got the best seat at the table. I mean, I got everything I could possibly want. Up until that moment, he thought he had seen everything. And then this light awakens him, and he sees so much more. Caravaggio makes a point of letting us understand it's not a natural light because he stuck a window in there. There's no light coming in through the window. He is introducing this incredibly powerful supernatural event that's highly personalized and yet incredibly universal. We can all imagine ourselves being one of these characters at the table. And just a little note about how this is put together in my very bad video, but the fact is, you'll notice that it's a side painting. We see this painting, we tend to think it's an altarpiece. It's not. It's a painting that's at the side of the chapel. It's the pendant of the other painting of the death of Matthew. And if you look at the way the figures are ordered, Jesus is closest to the altar. The light that is coming in from above his head is coming from the altar. I don't need to remind you, Jesus likes to call himself, light a lot. And then on the other side, we have the lesser figures who are closest to whom? Us. So look at the hierarchy of the space. When we go into that chapel, we are much closer to the outer figures, like these guys, right? These guys so totally absorbed in what's going on, the money, the counting, I got this, I got that, like I got a little extra this week. I just like to emphasize those hands. We've got, Matthew's got two hands. We've got one man here, His complete focus is on the coins. The other hand is Matthew's, who's holding the coin with one hand and gazing at Christ with the other. That moment of which will have the greater pull. And again, the light answers that question. There is a tremendous immediacy to this scene. This is something that people rarely notice in the painting, but take a look at Jesus' feet. And this is forestalling any of those questions about that ridiculous theory about that guy being Matthew. All right, there's a sort of a silly theory that goes around that this is Matthew. So I'm forestalling that by just pointing out something to you. Look at Jesus' feet. Do you see where he's going? Is he staying around? Does it really look like Jesus is sitting there to that guy going, okay, listen, whenever you're through counting that money, I'm good. Yeah, okay, I got time. Someone just order me in a pizza and I'll be ready when you are. That's not what conversion is about. That's not what 1600 is about. It's about right now. And so you see Jesus' feet. He is on his way, and either Matthew gets up or the moment is lost. That incredible sense of being caught, that wonder, that urgency of the image. And the third example I'm going to use of this period is something that is very dear to my heart, because this period of the Counter-Reformation has been slammed so thoroughly about by art history as a period being oppressive, a period because the church teaching confines artists, it ties their hands. Oh, having to follow some sort of artistic rule, it's like, oh my gosh, you're stifling art and you're making art something for just a little teeny tiny group of people who happen to be in the right crowd. Then how come the first professional female artist grew in exactly this milieu? The first woman to be paid to make a living, and let me tell you, a good living, the first woman to make a living painting was Lavinia Fontana. She rose up in the middle of the Counter-Reformation era, and who was her biggest sponsor? Gabriele Paliotti. So we're looking at a woman who will be the very first woman in the history of art to produce an altarpiece. You never heard of her, right? How many people have heard of this woman? Right. You want to know why you've never heard of her? Because she was happily married and she had 11 children. All right, so this is a work that the mission of artists so beautifully, as more than anything else, I just wanted to show it to you artists today, particularly you women artists. I wanted to show you this work. This was done in 1607. We're moving towards the tail end of her career. She's smashed every barrier. She's been paid 2,000 ducats, which is like, buy yourself a second house kind of money. She's been paid more than Caravaggio. She's painted for the King of Spain. She's painted for St. Paul's outside the walls. And then in 1607, and she's got a lot of kind of male detractors who say mean things about what is a woman doing painting altarpieces, and she paints this. And you have the Samaritan woman and Jesus. And it's an incredible rendering. I just love this work. It's an incredible rendering of scene 4 of John's Gospel, or the scene in chapter 4 of John's Gospel, where Jesus, who was just sitting by himself, strikes up a conversation with the Samaritan woman, ultimately sending her to announce the salvation to her people, and I just think it's a masterpiece. She's very alluring. You notice that? She's not some homely lady here that Jesus is talking to. Her clothes are beautifully rendered. She's a bit of a fashion plate herself, perhaps a leaf from Caravaggio's book. You get a little flash of legs peeking out from under the skirt there. But the beauty of this work is look at the engagement between the two of them. He's resting his head on his palm. He's looking up at her. He is listening. He is listening to her. And when he gestures towards her, when he starts talking about this offering of this water, you'll never be thirsty again, his gesture is offering, not ordering, offering. This gentleness, these two, this man and this woman, they are essentially accomplices in this divine plan. For that moment, Jesus makes this woman, the Samaritan woman, but at the same time, by extension, Lavinia Fontana, artist, this accomplice in sharing his message, his agent in preaching the gospel. The fun fact is that Lavinia's maiden name, Fontana, means fountain. So the fact that there's like a fountain right in the back there, right in the middle there, I think it kind of helps us understand what she was trying to get across here. I'm just showing you a couple more to show you there's a very different attitude, but these are other two, Veronese and Annibale Carracci. Annibale Carracci's is very lovely, but you have the woman who's kind of walking towards you. On the other side, you have sort of Jesus who's just talking to her while she keeps working. This one has much more of a sense of the two who are sharing in this mission of evangelization. And I forgot to mention, I had the little blow up of the apostles there. The apostles, one of my favorite parts of this, the apostles who are sitting there like, what's he doing talking to that woman? and over, and then they get this little teeny tiny part in the background. So I feel like Lavinia was talking to some of the male members of the Artistic Academy with that particular work. So this brings us to the magnificent age of enlightened patronage. The proliferation of commissions for both public and private devotion drew the greatest talents with the promise of status, fame, and wealth. That groundswell that gave us Lavinia Fontana, later we'll have Artemisia Gentileschi, would finally burst forth with Catholicism's most ambitious artistic style, the Baroque. Now, artists in this period began to draw on natural history, literary sources, optical devices, and many other fonts in the age of discovery. They're keeping up with science, with history, with technology, and as people, their audience, traveled and read and learned and experimented and questioned and explained, beliefs began to grow that science, human learning, they had answers for everything. So doubt began to stain human interaction with the divine, a doubt that would have to be dispelled by wonder. So artists had yet another challenge: how to lead the eye to the invisible glory of God. The mystics of the age prepared the way. The age prepared the way, but scientific developments would also have their role to play. Perhaps inspired in part by Galileo's improved telescopes, the 17th century began to think in terms of drawing the eye completely beyond the natural into the supernatural. It is beyond the scope of human vision. So the telescope would allow the mortal eye to see the moons around Jupiter. So artists, painters, sculptors, architects began to think of themselves as a kind of artistic telescope that would allow people to see something that mortal eyes were unable to see, but indeed that mystics were able to see. And so the idea is that wonder leads to wisdom, as Aristotle once said, and so even as audiences would be transported, they would gain a greater sense of things divine. And so this brings us to Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa, a chance to literally, a work that literally encompassed a viewer in mystery. On top of everything else, it's placed in the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria in a way that is supposed to really evoke wonder by surprise. You walk into the church, it's already there's a lot of stuff going on, but not until you get to the space of the altar and you turn, suddenly you are caught up in something that you were not expecting. And so this is the surprise. Surprise, as defined by John Mark Miraval, is the mind's attentive response to what it does not find obvious. The attentive response of the mind is the willingness to try to understand. And in that openness, human beings can also absorb faith. When Benedict XVI spoke of how beauty wounds, he was alluding to the vulnerability that beauty causes, allowing people to consider things that they, in ordinary circumstances, keep out of their lives. You keep a nice little bubble, shield, echo chamber, whatever you want to call it. The beauty, or wonder, is a way to create a chink in that armor. And once that chink is created, anything can get in. So in making this, he actually began to think in terms of cinema. Bernini really began to develop a cinematic mind. He took this story, the actual account of St. Teresa's visionary experiences of an angel who visited her and pierced her with an arrow, first causing pain, but replaced by this tremendous sweetness. And then he constructed literally a stage for it. So this incredible way that this back for a second. This incredible way that the three sides of the monument are all like a stage, with that one space for you, the viewer. You, the beholder, have the best seats in the house. He uses a very strong color contrast. There's red marble to represent the mortal world, the human world, that my friend of mine calls it the hamburger-colored marble, that surrounds you, giving you the idea of the carnal, the world of the flesh. Instead, the upper part of part. The chapel is all done in whites and golds, and of course, Teresa's and the angel sculpture are executed in white Carrara marble, which allow for this effect of this thing that is of the heavens that is happening within the context of the earth. We have seats on either side. It's kind of the family gets the little seats off to the side, whereas Teresa occupies the main stage. These are the members of the Cornaro family who you see, interestingly, they react in very different ways. Some are reading, some are studying, some are meditating. And it's an interesting thing because it's a reminder of how much we would love to have that vision, right? How much we would love to have the same certainty that Teresa has of the experience of the divine. Yes, this is what heaven looks like. Yes, this is what it feels like. Whereas these wise men who have studied and they hold church positions and they're responsible, they don't experience this. But they sit around and they have this devotion to the woman who does. And so Teresa becomes our guide in understanding or our guide or eyewitness to the supernatural. So we have the floating effect. The two of them appear to be floating. You have this heavy drapery that's used all over her body to create the concept of her interior motion. The way they refer to it as the interior agitation, even though the exterior part of her body looks very calm. Look at her face, look at her hand, and you realize that what it is that Teresa does is she completely submits herself to God. As a matter of fact, it's very similar, that position of Teresa, to someone else who submitted himself completely to the will of the Father. And so what Teresa has done to receive this tremendous reward of this preview of the heavenly afterlife is that she has given herself to God in emulation of Jesus. And so this very kind of beautiful way of drawing the viewer in, showing us this extraordinary example, and then allowing us to see beyond. Truly an occasion of wonder. The idea of collectively transporting the faithful was one of the greatest missions of Roman churches. So Bernini sort of starts this on a smaller scale. This is a small chapel in a small church. But later on, for those of you who know St. Peter's, Bernini is going to be able to translate this into an entire church in Sant'Andrea Quirinale, and he transports this, he basically translates it into the immense altar of the chair in St. Peter's. We are punctuated by wonder in the city of Rome, created by these incredible experiences which mix surprise, extraordinary technical skill, and then a vision that's really meant to bring people upwards. And this collective vision becomes really a almost fad for the end of the 17th century. And it's something that, oh, I see, I made that nice little thing too. Something that they intend to try to transport all over the world, because it's a very successful idea. If you can make people feel wonder in Rome, why limit it to Rome? Why not think about bringing that wonder of the faith to the four corners of the world? So in Sant'Ignazio in Rome, the Jesuit church, which at the time was celebrating this missionary order par excellence, we see this amazing work by Andrea Pozzo, who uses the exceptional illusion. You come into a church of a relatively small doorway, you walk into a double height ceiling, and you look up and you just see, you're transported. The ceiling has dissolved. The most amazing thing about this crazy thing is the maximum height of the ceiling is where the top of that arch is. So actually it's a shallow vault, right? But it looks like it's an express elevator to heaven. And the use of the aerial perspective, and we see Jesus floating off in the distance, and then there's Ignatius, and the light of Ignatius to the four corners of the world, and the four corners of the world. Because what does beautiful art do? What does wonder do? It unites us. It is something that makes us feel part of something, whether you're standing in the Sistine Chapel or St. Peter's, surrounded by people of different, who all look different, speak different, act different, but we're all looking in the same direction. We feel the same thing. We can start a conversation with each other in the amazement, the awe, the appreciation of these skills. And so this is very early on represented when Andrea Pozzo shows us the aim, the mission of the Jesuits to bring the four corners of the world together to Christ, using art as the medium in which to express it. We have here Europe, we have Asia, we have Africa, and the Americas are not looking too good. You'll notice everybody else seems to be dressed and composed, and the Americans are looking a little wild and woolly. Anyway. All right, so I'm gonna sort of, this is the arc that I wanted to talk about, and I'm just gonna end with a little bit of an epilogue, because of course, doing tours and showing people these things, the inevitable question I get is, what happened? What went wrong? How come we don't do this anymore? And so after, how did this great age of artistic productivity decline, and how can it be revived? So I'm just gonna close with a few considerations, a couple red flags, and a bit of good news. So the achievement and wonder in art was immediately condemned in the Enlightenment, which dismissed the Baroque as the decaying byproduct of the Renaissance. They really hated the Baroque. Sacred art in this environment looked to relate stories without passions. This is not to say, that this is not beautiful in its own right, but it is an art that's not meant to instill wonder. It's not meant to work up the passions. It's a very rational, clear, austere, and organized art, very, very easy to understand. And that became the aesthetic ideal of the age. However, sacred art began to follow in the footsteps of secular art instead of vice versa, until mainstream art finally decided to dismiss the sacred as subject matter and champion artistic freedom as the greatest good of art. So subjectivity became the subject of art, and anything from a urinal to a shark in formaldehyde became art if the artist deemed it so. And here we are today, living in an age where reality itself is in the eye or the mind of the beholder. And mystery is something that we either fear or we must explain. And so, or it has some sort of explanation. Even Catholic art has been, to some extent, infected with the disease of artistic relativism, often losing sight of the incarnational nature of art made by Christians. Christian art once championed the truth of the Word made flesh, and rediscovering that balance between the human and the divine is the new challenge for artists. Taking Michelangelo's Pietà and substituting Jesus with the cause du jour reduces the universality of the work. Again, this sort of partisan, taking a great work of art and turning it into a partisan of identity politics is really, instead of uniting people at Christ's cross, kind of creates these little camps where they're taking the work of art and trying to make it serve whatever individual purpose that they want it to. So it's also important to resist the temptation that truth can only be told in the ugly and brutal. And again, I was sort of amazed listening to Sorab's. I was like, well, you just basically did my presentation for me, the last part of my presentation for me. It cannot be found in the ugly or it can only be found in the ugly and the brutal. That's an artistic nihilism. And the need to make artistic statements about the imminent, about the right here, the right now, this problem at this moment, precludes an openness to the transcendent, to a bigger, larger picture. The reality of sin and suffering has always been present. It was present when Leonardo painted, when Caravaggio painted, when the early Christians painted in the catacombs, but the Christian faith is about redemption. And so all souls are in a journey. They always are in a journey, and they can only be, and every soul can indeed be unstuck from a space in which it is in sin. So art can serve as a motivation for unsticking ourselves from sin. It's like putting a picture of a really nice dress on the refrigerator to make you stay on a diet. It presents the world as it could be. Art can present us as we should be. The Catholic imagination, that unique vision of death, suffering, and injustice, how can we show that to the world is what I'm asking you artists. How can we look beyond the brutality of that and get a bigger picture? Finally, also, renewal is not the same thing as novelty. While there is no point in just trying to imitate Raphael or Baroque or Angelico, it doesn't mean that you have to celebrate innovation for innovation's sake. Salvation history that we have recounted for 2 millennia is always new to each generation, and it speaks to each person differently. So embracing the past to inspire the present doesn't mean that we just retread the old, the virtues, the role models, and the essential teachings need to be reimagined to speak to a new generation. How do you talk about St. Agnes the girl who died to save her purity, to a group of 19-year-olds who are studying abroad and can't wait to hook up with the first guy who shows up in the campus. But there must be a way that we can take those stories and make them fresh and new, to make all things new. During the artistic revolution at the beginning of the 20th century, the artists tried to shock people. And this is sort of a note that shock is not wonder. This first artistic revolution was simply garish colors, distorted compositions, scandalous subject matter. The trend has only continued into the present age. Shock stimulates. It stimulates rage, lust, revulsion, discomfort. It rattles, but it does not open the heart. And Pope Benedict XVI, I think, put it particularly beautifully when he explained that too often the beauty that is thrust on us is illusory and deceitful, superficial and blinding, leaving the onlooker dazed instead of bringing him out of himself and opening him up to horizons of true freedom as it draws him aloft. It imprisons him within himself and further enslaves him, depriving him of hope and joy. Or, in a pithier version from Sherlock Holmes, to the man who loves art for its own sake, it is frequently its least important and lowliest manifestations that are where the keenest pleasure is to be derived. Artists have so the good news is artists have exciting new techniques. I think it was particularly interesting to hear Cameron talking about all the opportunities for filmmakers today. And so we have, from computer graphics, things that cameras can do, the opportunity, the hunger for it. There is a space. You're not climbing up an unreceptive wall. But when we talk about making art for today, if blockbuster cinema can sweep people into the craziest, most improbable space adventures, and reality television reveals the interior life of the shallow, what if the Catholic imagination was able to transform these media to reveal the extraordinary journey of a soul and the complex beauty of the spiritual life? But this is not the province of artists alone. The golden age of art was fueled by an engaged public. So we don't just look at the artists and go, well, hi guys, why can't you make something better? It was fueled by the engaged public who kept themselves informed of what happened in the art world. They surrounded themselves with art at home, their favorite saints, their inspirational scripture stories, redemptive reminders. They competed with other patrons to obtain the finest works. It is the work of all Catholics to revive art, to love it, to own it, to understand it, so as to allow it to beautify our world and help people understand, to quote Pope Francis, that the perception, I forgot, these are the popes, this is a whole series of popes who have actually helped us over the years. It's not that the magisterium has been lacking. We have had from John the 23rd, who befriended atheist artists. We have Paul VI in his famous first meeting with artists in the Sistine Chapel, John Paul II, the cleaning of the Sistine Chapel, and the letter to artists, Benedict XVI. We have had magisterium after magisterium after magisterium who have assisted us. It's now our turn to pick up the banner and start running with it. As, again, I was about to say, Pope Francis tells us that the perception and the contemplation of beauty generates a sense of hope that can light up our world. So my last words to you are, artists and art lovers, go set the world on fire. Thank you.